Eleanor Wren smelled the smoke before she heard the gunfire, and by the time she reached the ridge above her barn with a shotgun cradled in her arms, a man was already crawling through her fence line, one hand pressed hard against his side, blood soaking dark through a grey shirt that the grey dawn light made look almost black rather than red. She had buried her husband 14 months earlier, thrown from a wagon on a stretch of road that had never once been dangerous before that particular morning. And she had spent every one of those 14 months discovering that a widow holding 1,100 acres of grazing land in Wyoming Territory alone was a fact the county treated as an opportunity rather than a loss to be respected. The stranger was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulders, with a bullet wound low in his ribs and a revolver still holstered at his hip that he made no attempt to reach. A small stillness that told Eleanor something important about him before he had managed to speak a single word to her. She would think back on that stillness many times in the years afterward, the particular quality of a man choosing patience over instinct, even while badly hurt. The wound looked serious enough that another hour untreated might well have finished what the bullet started. A man fleeing the law goes for his weapon the instant a shadow falls over him, reaching for it the way another man reaches for a lifeline in deep water. A man fleeing something considerably worse than the law often simply lies still in the dirt and waits, patient even in pain, to learn whether the person standing over him means to finish what someone else had already started that morning. He said, through a jaw clenched tight against the pain, that his name was Thomas Calder, that his horse had thrown him after a shot went wide somewhere behind him, and that he would be obliged for water and would trouble her for nothing further than that small kindness. It was, Eleanor would come to understand much later, only the first of several things Thomas Calder told her that morning that were not, strictly speaking, true, though she did not know that yet as she knelt beside him in her own dooryard and pressed her shawl hard against the wound, already calculating the distance to the barn. She noted, even in that first frantic moment, that his voice carried none of the rough edges she associated with the drifters who sometimes passed through looking for trouble or easy work. Whatever trade he had followed before landing bloodied at her gate, it had not been the rough, unlettered work of most men who wandered through that stretch of the territory looking for a season's wages. To understand what Eleanor Wren was fighting so fiercely to keep, you first have to understand what her husband Joseph had built with his own hands before that lonely stretch of road took him from her forever. They had come to the Powder River country together in 1869, filed a claim on good bottomland fed by 2 reliable springs, and spent 9 patient years turning open, unbroken prairie into one of the more respected horse operations anywhere in the territory, helped enormously by the plain, unglamorous fact that their land sat directly across the survey line the railroad had quietly marked years earlier for a future depot. That single detail made the Wren claim worth far more than the animals grazing peacefully on it. Joseph died in the autumn of 1878, when his wagon wheel shattered on a road he had travelled 100 times without the slightest trouble, an accident the county coroner ruled entirely ordinary, and Eleanor had never once managed to fully believe was anything but arranged by someone with a reason. She had told herself for months that grief alone would pass, and slowly understood what remained beneath it was a colder, more useful resolve. Joseph had always said the springs alone made the claim worth defending against anyone, and Eleanor had spent the months since his death slowly understanding just how literally other men had taken that same assessment. Her neighbor to the east, a cattleman named Cassius Redmond, had wanted the Wren land since well before Joseph's death, citing the survey line at every opportunity that presented itself, and had made Eleanor 3 increasingly generous offers in the months following the funeral. Each one of them politely and firmly refused. Redmond's answer to refusal was never open confrontation, but instead a slow, deniable siege that never quite crossed the line into anything a county sheriff could reasonably act upon. A well that ran unaccountably brackish one long summer, for no clear reason anyone could name. A note held against the ranch, originally arranged through a bank in Cheyenne, suddenly called due under terms that shifted twice without any real explanation offered. Eleanor's exhaustion, then, was not merely grief for Joseph, though there was plenty of that still. It was the particular weariness of a woman defending something built with her own hands, against a man patient enough to dismantle it in pieces too small to ever fight directly at once, always at a careful distance he could later deny under oath. She had stopped expecting fairness from the county some time ago and had instead started keeping careful written records of every strange incident in a ledger she told no one about. Thomas Calder carried a very different kind of siege entirely, one that had nothing to do with land or water or old debts owed to a neighbor. His true name was not Calder, and his true trade was not drifting quietly from ranch to ranch looking for work. He had spent 7 years as an investigator for a Denver agency that railroads and land offices hired whenever fraud grew too large or too well connected for a local sheriff to ever properly touch. And 16 months earlier, he had testified in a federal inquiry into a survey rigging scheme that reached, by the time the hearings finally closed, into the pockets of men considerably more powerful than the low-level clerks who actually stood trial before a judge. The men who escaped that particular reckoning had not forgotten the investigator who had named them one by one in open testimony. His partner on the case, a younger man named Everett Doyle, had been found dead outside a Cheyenne rooming house 4 months after the hearings ended, in circumstances the local marshal called an unfortunate robbery, and Thomas had never once, for a single day, believed. Thomas had read every newspaper account of the hearings twice over in the months that followed, searching each time for some sign the men behind it had truly been stopped, and finding none. Thomas had been moving steadily since that night, under a new name in every county he passed quietly through, carrying the particular guilt of a man convinced his own carelessness had gotten his partner killed, and determined never again to let anyone stand close enough to him to pay that same terrible price for knowing him. Here was the compatibility neither of them could yet see clearly, bleeding and bandaging by lamplight in the small room off Eleanor's kitchen that first difficult night. Eleanor needed someone with the patience and the particular skill to expose a slow, deniable campaign that had already defeated every direct approach she had tried and exhausted over 14 long months. Thomas needed, though he had not once admitted it to himself in 16 months of constant running, a reason worth finally stopping for. A reason substantial enough to justify using the very skills he had spent that same year and a half trying hard to convince himself he no longer possessed at all. He had told himself for 16 months that stopping anywhere for long was itself a kind of danger, and had never once considered that the greater danger might be refusing to stop at all. It would take him most of that first winter to admit, even privately to himself, that some part of him had already begun looking for reasons to stay, rather than reasons to move on again. Thomas's fever broke on the 4th night, and Eleanor, who had sat up with him alone through most of the worst of it, found herself strangely reluctant to ask the one question she had been holding since the dooryard, which was simply who had shot him and for what reason he would not say. She asked it anyway the following morning, setting a plate of food in front of him with the brisk practicality of a woman who had decided that gratitude for her careful nursing did not exempt any guest from an honest answer to a fair question. Thomas said only that it concerned an old debt between men, and that it was better for them both if he said nothing further on the matter. Eleanor understood at once that this was not the whole truth, and quite possibly none of it at all. But she had learned over 14 difficult months that pressing a guarded man too hard only teaches him to lie more carefully rather than more honestly with her. And so she let the answer stand for now, in exchange for the plain, useful fact that he was healing well, and clearly the kind of man who paid his debts in honest labor when he could not pay them any other way. She decided, watching him eat in careful silence, that whatever debt he owed elsewhere, he owed her nothing yet beyond honest work, and that the accounting between them could wait. He began working the ranch within 10 days, favoring the healing wound at first, then with a growing competence that suggested he had done this work before, in an earlier life he never named. Eleanor noticed the attention he paid to small details, oddly out of place for a hired hand. Exactly which riders passed the boundary line, and at what hour, and careful questions about Redmond's holdings and the disputed springs feeding both ranches. She began telling him more, not from any plan, but because he listened with a focus none of her remaining hired men matched, and one evening, mending fence as the light failed, she asked plainly, why a healing man seemed so interested in her long trouble with Redmond. Thomas was quiet a long moment, deciding how much of himself was safe to reveal, and said finally that he used to be the kind of man who looked into precisely this sort of trouble for a living, and left the rest unspoken. It was the first entirely true thing he had told her since the dooryard. She watched him differently afterward, noticing the automatic glance he gave toward doors and unfamiliar riders in town, a habit she had mistaken for wound wariness and now recognized as the trained instinct of a man who once made his living noticing what others missed. Some part of her wondered what other habits from that unnamed life he had never managed to leave behind on the road. Redmond's patience hardened into something considerably sharper once word reached him that a stranger had settled quietly at the Wren place, mending fences and asking, by several accounts around town, unusually detailed questions about water rights and old survey markers. He rode out himself, with two of his hands flanking him on either side, and found Eleanor and Thomas working together the fence line nearest the disputed spring that both ranches depended on. Redmond did not dismount from his horse. He studied Thomas with the flat, assessing look of a man carefully cataloguing a brand-new problem he had not anticipated, and remarked to Eleanor, in the false courtesy he always wore like a well-tailored coat, that he certainly hoped a widow living alone had considered how such an arrangement might look to the wider county. Eleanor answered evenly that her own arrangements were entirely her own affair and no one else's, and Redmond's thin smile suggested he had expected precisely that answer and had asked the question mainly to plant it, the way a careful man plants a seed he fully intends to watch grow into gossip without his own hand ever showing in the matter. Thomas said nothing at all during the exchange, and Eleanor noticed afterward that his silence had none of the passivity she once mistook it for, but rather the deliberate stillness of a man taking careful notes. The pressure sharpened within weeks. The recalled note from the Cheyenne Bank demanded full repayment within 45 days, citing vague irregularities no one at the bank could fully explain. The second spring, untouched until now, began running unaccountably low, despite no real drought. Thomas read the letter twice at the kitchen table, his expression sharpening into a focus Eleanor had not seen on him before. A third blow followed within the month, smaller but somehow the one that troubled her most. A hired man named Caleb Ford, steady through 2 full seasons, gave sudden notice and would not meet her eyes, explaining a family matter that shifted with every telling. Thomas told her afterward that Ford's story carried the shape of an account given by a frightened man paid or threatened into leaving, and that it troubled him more than the note or the spring, since it meant Redmond was now reaching directly into her household. He asked to see the loan papers and the spring records, and Eleanor brought him everything she had. He spent 2 evenings working through it, with a patience that reminded her of a man doing work he had once been very good at, and had spent a long time pretending to forget. On the 3rd evening he set the papers down and said he believed he understood what was being done to her and could prove it. But proving it, he said carefully, meant becoming a genuinely different kind of man than the one who had spent 2 quiet months mending her fences without complaint. And he owed her the honest truth of himself before he went any further down that road, because once he moved openly, the men he had spent 16 months running from might yet find their way back to him through the very records he would now have to touch directly. He told her everything that long evening, holding nothing back from her at last. His real name, which she would only ever use quietly between the two of them from that night forward. The 7 years spent investigating fraud out of Denver for the agency, the survey rigging case, and the powerful men who had escaped its final reckoning through connections. Everett Doyle, found dead outside a rooming house 4 months after the hearings finally closed for good. The 16 months of moving steadily under a new name in every county since that night, always watching doors, always calculating the fastest way out of any room he entered. She did not flinch once through any of it, though her hand tightened slightly around her cup each time he mentioned Everett Doyle's name, as though absorbing some small part of that old loss herself. He admitted afterward he had rehearsed the confession alone and still found it harder to say aloud than expected. Eleanor listened without interrupting, the way she had once listened to Joseph work through a hard decision. When he finished, she asked whether the same men might still be looking for him, and he answered that it was possible, that the syndicate had reached into banks and land offices across 3 territories, and that using his skills openly now carried a real chance someone would trace the pattern back to him. He told her he had come to her gate by accident, bleeding from an unrelated dispute, and never meant to bring his old troubles near her land, but could not help her the way she needed without using the exact skills that had made him a target in the first place. Eleanor understood the shape of the choice he was offering. Ask him to remain a hired hand and keep fighting Redmond alone with the same blunt tools that had already failed her. Or ask him to become openly the investigator he had spent a year and a half disappearing from, risking both their dangers landing on the same small ranch at once. She asked what became of him if he stayed hidden and she lost the land anyway. He said he went on being safe elsewhere, while Joseph's ranch passed into other hands. She asked what became of him if he helped and it worked. He answered, after a long quiet, that he would finally have done one honest thing since Everett Doyle died, instead of running from not having saved him. Eleanor reached across the worn table and covered his hand with hers, the very first time she had touched him with anything beyond a nurse's practical care since that first night at the gate, and told him simply that then they would do it together, under whatever name kept him safest while they worked side by side. Thomas built the case methodically after that, the way he had once built dozens of others for federal prosecutors, tracing the recalled note back carefully through the bank's own correspondence and discovering, through patient indirect letters written under his old credentials, that the complaint triggering the sudden recall had come not from any real irregularity at all, but from a filing clerk who happened to be Redmond's own cousin by marriage. The dried spring took considerably longer to prove conclusively, but he found it eventually too, riding the boundary line alone at night, until he located a narrow diversion channel, freshly dug, redirecting a good portion of the flow onto Redmond's own land before it ever reached the Wren property downstream. Word of his methodical work spread quietly through the county over those weeks, and some of it reached Redmond within days, though he said nothing openly about it. No one in town yet understood what quiet Thomas Calder had spent those long evenings building at Eleanor's kitchen table. Caleb Ford proved easier to trace than Thomas had originally expected, working a ranch 2 counties south under his own name still, and a careful letter sent under Thomas's old credentials, along with a firm promise of confidentiality, drew a reluctant but genuinely useful reply, admitting that a man claiming to speak for Redmond had paid him $60 outright, and made clear that continued work at the Wren Ranch would go quite poorly for him afterward. None of it alone would satisfy a courtroom on its own merits, but taken together with the diverted spring and the falsified bank complaint, it formed a pattern far too consistent to ever dismiss as simple misfortune or coincidence. Thomas documented all of it with the same careful method he had once used for federal prosecutors years earlier, dates and witnesses laid out plainly in an account built to survive a sharp lawyer's questioning rather than collapse quickly under it. It was while delivering a quiet, formal inquiry to the Cheyenne Bank's regional examiner, under his true name for the first time in 16 long months, that his 2 separate secrets finally, fully collided at last. He kept a second copy of every document hidden separately from the first, an old habit from his Denver years he had never quite managed to unlearn, even after so many months of running. The examiner, carefully reviewing his credentials that afternoon, recognized the name at once from the survey rigging hearings years earlier, and remarked, with nothing but genuine professional curiosity in his voice, that he had heard the lead investigator on that case had simply vanished after his partner's death, and seemed truly glad to learn the man was alive and still doing such careful, honest work somewhere. It was an entirely innocent remark from a man with no real tie whatsoever to the syndicate Thomas still feared, but it meant his real name had surfaced in an official record for the very first time in a full year and a half. A fact he understood clearly, riding back slowly toward the ranch afterward, might eventually reach exactly the men he had spent that entire year and a half so carefully avoiding at every turn. He had already made his choice days earlier, across Eleanor's kitchen table, of course, but riding home through the dark that night, with the finished case against Redmond finally complete, he understood fully, for the very first time, precisely what that choice might yet cost him personally. He said nothing to the examiner beyond what the inquiry required, though the walk back to his horse afterward felt considerably longer than the walk in had been only an hour before. Eleanor and Thomas brought the finished case together to the county sheriff and, far more decisively, to a territorial land examiner Thomas had once worked alongside years earlier on an entirely different fraud matter. A man whose considerable authority Redmond could not quietly pressure, the way he had long managed the local sheriff for years without much difficulty. The evidence held together completely under scrutiny. The diverted channel, freshly dug and clearly traceable, straight onto Redmond's own land for anyone to see. The bank clerk's complaint, filed by his own cousin without any genuine irregularity behind it whatsoever. 18 months of small, deniable cruelties that, laid out plainly together at last, formed a clear and provable campaign, rather than merely a string of unrelated misfortunes. Redmond rode out to the ranch one final time, entirely alone this time, in the week the examiner's office formally opened its inquiry, and found Eleanor and Thomas standing together near the very same fence line where he had once delivered his false courtesy about a widow's fragile reputation, his confidence now considerably thinner than it had been 18 months before. The examiner read through the full account twice before setting it down and remarked quietly that he had rarely seen a case built with such patient, deliberate thoroughness in all his years. He said only, with visibly less confidence than before, that they had made a great deal of trouble for him, Calder, or whatever his real name truly was these days. Thomas answered evenly that his name was his own private business, but that the plain facts remained, regardless of what anyone called him. A diverted spring, a falsified bank complaint, a hired man quietly paid to abandon his post, all of it now thoroughly documented and witnessed, and sitting squarely on the territorial examiner's desk, and there was simply no version of the coming months that ended well for him now. Redmond looked at Eleanor a long, silent moment, the particular expression of a man calculating far too late the true cost of 18 months spent badly underestimating a widow he had wrongly assumed would eventually simply give up and sell. He turned his horse without another word spoken. Within the year, facing both the examiner's formal inquiry and a civil suit Eleanor filed for real damages, Redmond quietly sold off the greater part of his own holdings to cover the resulting settlements, a far quieter and more thorough defeat than any single dramatic confrontation could ever have delivered. Eleanor said nothing further either, content to let the documented facts speak plainly for themselves after 18 long months of being told her word alone was not enough for anyone. The cost to Thomas arrived slower and gentler than he had feared. His true name surfaced twice more in territorial records that year, tied to the Redmond case, but the men who had once hunted him, whether they had lost his trail or simply moved on, never came. He stayed watchful for the better part of 2 years, a habit Eleanor never tried to talk him out of, understanding that a man who lost a partner to exactly this danger had earned his own caution. Slowly, the watchfulness eased into ordinary alertness, the same weariness any rancher carries toward weather and rustlers, rather than the vigilance of a man waiting for one specific reckoning. Thomas stayed on through that winter and the one after, and somewhere in that stretch stopped thinking of himself as a man hiding under a borrowed name and began thinking of himself simply as a rancher who had once, in another life, investigated fraud for a living. He and Eleanor married the following spring, in a small ceremony, at the same house where he had first opened his fevered eyes to find a widow pressing her shawl against his wound. Eleanor kept Joseph's name beside her own on the deed, and Thomas never suggested otherwise, understanding the land had been built by 2 people, and one of them deserved to remain named on it, regardless of who she married afterward. They rebuilt the dooryard gate together the following summer, sturdier than the original, and Thomas carved a small private mark into the post that meant nothing to anyone else who might read it, a reminder of a night when 2 people, each carrying a dangerous secret, chose to risk those secrets colliding rather than face their separate dangers alone. Thomas liked to say in later years that the bullet which had knocked him from his horse outside that gate had done him a strange kindness, forcing a stop he would never have chosen for himself, in the one place where stopping turned out to be exactly what both of them needed. Eleanor and Thomas ranched the Wren land together for 31 years, and the springs ran clean for all of them, and the rail depot that had once made the land a target eventually made it valuable in an honest way instead. Proof Eleanor liked telling her grandchildren that what men once tried to take by force had rewarded patience and plain work. Caleb Ford, the hired man once frightened off, wrote to Eleanor years later after Redmond's fall had become common knowledge, apologizing for his silence and asking whether his old position might still be open. Eleanor hired him back without hesitation, telling Thomas that a man honest enough to admit his own fear, even years too late, deserved a second chance. Redmond had never once offered anyone. Tell me in the comments below which secret you believe was truly harder to risk revealing in the end. Eleanor's long, quiet fight to keep her husband's land, or Thomas's real name after 16 months spent running so carefully from it across 3 territories. And if you enjoyed this story and want another tale about 2 people whose separate hidden dangers eventually became the very thing that finally, truly brought them together against all odds, the next one is already waiting patiently for you right now. Eleanor lived to see her grandchildren ride that same fence line as easily as she once had, and told them, more than once in her later years, that the hardest part of the whole ordeal had never been Redmond, or the money, or even the fear, but simply learning to trust a stranger enough to let him carry part of her burden. Thomas, for his part, would say only that he had spent 16 months believing safety meant staying alone, and had needed a bullet and a stubborn widow's gate to teach him otherwise for good. Neither of them ever forgot how close that first winter had come to ending very differently, for either one of them had the other simply chosen to look away at the gate. That knowledge, more than the land or the money ever recovered, was the thing they chose to pass down.